Maintenant, c'est un moment qui va être difficile pour nous autres, les hommes de sexe masculin, qui est d'entendre le questionnement critique de Meredith Nash sur cette question: le temps est-il masculin ou féminin? En termes plus abstraits, le temps a-t-il un genre? Je cherchais une personne qui pourrait répondre à ces questions. Et j'ai trouvé Meredith Nash à l'université de Hobart, en Tasmanie, cette île qui est au sud de l'Australie. Vous voyez, j'ai cherché assez loin, mais j'ai trouvé une personne qui travaille depuis des années sur ce thème. Elle est sociologue, on va dire critique, mais comment ne pas être critique par rapport à l'interprétation masculine du temps à laquelle nous nous sommes si bien habitués et qui permet un certain pouvoir masculin dans la vie quotidienne. Alors, le temps universel dont parlait Marc, peut-être qu'elle va nous dire aussi qu'il est machiste, je ne sais pas, mais j'attends les réponses comme vous. Meredith Nash, s'il vous plaît. Please come here.
Today I'm talking about, does time have a gender, breaking feminist waves? My experience of time as free came to a sudden halt on the 7th of May this year. Literally, overnight, I lost all my free time the moment that August entered the world. I could no longer relish in the decadence of doing nothing. His cries were urgent and insistent. He had to be attended to no matter what the time. But time was no longer predictable. It could no longer be neatly divided into day or night, free or allocated. The reality is that I'm now on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I am linked directly to the biological rhythms of my baby. Like many new mothers, I've experienced this shift in my experience of time as a sense of loss. My life now revolves around trying to generate time, to win back time for myself. And this is not as straightforward as it would seem. The abstract time of the clock cannot be imposed on a newborn, as I've discovered. I had to get to know my baby's bodily rhythms first, attending to his cries, and actually trying to work out what they meant. I have to plan all of my bodily needs around his bodily needs. Sometimes this has meant going for a run at 3 a.m., simply so I can have a break from his body on mine. My baby has learned to trust me as his constant caregiver. But now that he's a bit older, at nearly 7 months, we've established some routines that are more flexible and that allow me to predict some of his future needs and to prepare ahead of time. This has generated some space in the present, some free time to allocate to other tasks. But really, it's my relationship with myself that motherhood is interrupted. And it's a comfort and a fright to say these words aloud. Questions of pregnancy and motherhood have preoccupied the majority of my life, to such distraction that I spent more than 10 years writing about it in the early part of my academic career. My changed relationship with time shouldn't have been a surprise to me, but it was. As the writer Sheila Heti has said, sitting at a desk, blithely unaware of the time rushing by, is a privilege reserved for the childless, like staying out dancing till 4 a.m. or going to the movies at a moment's notice. And indeed, I wrote this talk over 6 weeks in 15-minute bursts. So the irony of writing a talk on this topic is surely not lost on me. Plenty of academics are mothers, of course, but academic writing depends on hoarding time, of putting up a boundary between oneself and the immediate world in order to visit a separate one in the mind. A mother must make herself always available, but an academic often needs to shut the door. Time is power. Time has a gender. I relate this story on becoming a mother in order to frame how feminist theory provides us with new ways of thinking about time and the multiplicity of gendered temporalities that order contemporary social life. Because discursively speaking, women have no time. Time is constructed as masculine, dynamic, and it's inherently political. In 1687, Isaac Newton defined time as linear and detached from human experience. The linear conception of time, where time is seen as unfolding in a straight line, which is unbroken, is really the conception of time that has predominated. Much of sociological analysis has understood time as a resource, and particularly in terms of how it relates to capitalism. But historically, sociologists didn't reflect much upon time when discussing the power structures of society. Durkheim noted that time is socially constructed and linked to a society that encloses the individual. Time spent in production is in some ways central to the thinking of Marx. But even though these sociologists discuss time, neither of them deals with time as being crucial for their theories, nor do they theorize gender. Now, for feminists, in contrast, the rubric of time is offered the possibility of unmaking the forms of relationality that we think we know. And this radical change of perspective associated with a feminist critique of time is referred to by the term woman's time. And so this notion of woman's time emerges from feminist movements since the 1960s. So in particular, feminists were positioning these dominant modes of understanding time as sexist and patriarchal. So for instance, in her very celebrated 1979 essay, Woman's Time, Les Temps des Femmes, Julia Kristeva proposed a more complex understanding of historical time that was characterized by a multiplicity of temporalities, or what she refers to as attitudes. For Kristeva, women's time serves as a grounded source of criticism based on women's marginalization by patriarchal time. Kristeva contends that feminists became enveloped in a project of giving language to the intersubjective and corporeal experiences of women that were silenced in the past. What is it to be a woman other than merely non-man? Whether women are said to have time depends on constructions of women's history and of women as subjects. Crucial in these sorts of constructions are gender divisions of time associated with the public versus the private spheres. Now, public time has traditionally been associated with production and male life. Feminist political theorists, for instance, have shown that women's political activity was really hampered by understandings of public politics as opposite to and separate from what we refer to as the private sphere. The private sphere includes domestic life, the family, personal relationships, all of which have been considered natural and less subject to the rationalized timekeeping of capitalism. Social meanings of time construct the private sphere as having a sort of timelessness that's associated with nature and the reproductive cycle. It's cyclical time. So feminists then moved us outside the confines of a patriarchal, heteronormative chronometry and allowed us freedom to define notions of life with a feminist lens. So when we talk about women's time is the time of women who become subjects. The recognition of differences between women, so we're talking about things like race, social class, sexuality. These are also integral to women's writings on time. So when we're talking about women's time, we're talking about the meeting point of multiple experiences of time and its use as a vehicle of feminist knowledge. And indeed, feminism itself was partially constituted by the gendered nature of social constructions of temporality, but it has also constituted a challenge to these constructions. So for instance, second wave feminists implicitly and explicitly challenged understandings and uses of time and space within the society around them. They represented time and space as relational, about relationships, that it's interwoven and created understandings of women to counter these dominant associations with women in unchanging space. In the second wave, women were represented as moving forward in time, as progressive, whereas men were the anchors seen to be dragging them down, standing still. The importance of this was that feminists created a space-time where embodied women could supposedly be free from the distortions of patriarchy. So, for instance, consciousness raising is an important example of how feminists tried to use the shared experiences of women to understand what it meant to have a woman's body in the time and space of patriarchal culture. It is for this reason that embodied experience became the privileged basis of feminist knowledge, and also a central plank in debates about when the personal is political. So valuing time devoted to relationships and to caring for others was another way in which feminists challenged conventional understandings of time and space that was based around capitalist production. In making time for others, feminists resisted the self-serving, profit-orientated logic of patriarchal capitalist societies. But since then, we have seen lots of examples of feminists thinking through the temporal. Now, much of this thinking is centered on the notion that women's engagement in time-giving means a lack of control over time as a resource within patriarchal capitalist societies. Because again, feminists have generally argued over many decades that time is multiple and that it's linked to power. That means they do not see time as only clock time or as linear time that is neatly divided into these different components. Rather, feminists picture time as a web where people can move around, a time situated in one compartment and sometimes in many compartments simultaneously. Power is related to time, since time is an essential resource to which access may be unequally distributed. Those who have more power in their relationships are more likely to be able to manage their own time and the time of others in both the private and public realms. So in this way, feminist theory is important because it calls into question the representation of time in capitalist societies and provides an approach that points to a different conception of the relationship between life and time for both women and men. But it has also led to a feminist epistemology based on a non-linear logic of knowledge. So for instance, as I started to show at the very start of this talk, feminist writings on pregnancy and birth explicitly make this point as these key embodied experiences in which social and personal time overlap. For women, as I've said, their time has rarely been their own, given that their roles in most societies have functioned around caring for other people and for families. So in this way, feminist scholarship has primarily been concerned with women's lack of time. Because when it comes to reproduction, again, women's bodies are represented as being constrained by time. Feminist scholars have argued that women are granted no space or time of their own in relation to reproduction. Rather, time dominates studies of the life cycle for women, which is presented in terms of very familiar biological phases, like conception, pregnancy, and then motherhood. And of course, the metaphor of the biological clock is a familiar one. In this metaphor, time is literally of the essence for women who want to conceive, even though we know that the clock ticks for men as well. Wanting to have a baby was the greatest secret I had kept from myself. I used to feel guilty that I had too much time in my child-free land, until I started to feel the urgent pangs of baby hunger. Almost overnight, time was apparently against me. It was me against the clock as I crept towards 38. It was like looking down the barrel of a 38, with visions of my eggs rapidly deteriorating. The race to get pregnant was compressed into the urgency of right now and the potential of an empty future. But then pregnancy happened far too quickly. But the experience of it was slow, so slow. As I looked at the pregnancy app on my phone, which compared the size of my fetus to a familiar fruit or vegetable, each week I craved the moment when we would finally be at cauliflower or watermelon. As Iris Marion Young, the feminist philosopher, says, pregnant existence entails, finally, a unique temporality of process and growth in which the woman can experience herself as split between past and future. So if second wave feminism began from this assumption that women did not have time, then part of their political action was aimed at demanding a redistribution of time with other social resources, but also recognition of alternative definitions of temporality. For example, the polychronic nature of time for feminisms means that women doing several things at once is often the norm, or what we call multitasking. But the thing is that the parameter for action is not necessarily linear and quantitative as we would expect. In caring for children, for instance, time is more of a process and it's enmeshed with overlapping activities. So for example, if a newborn needs to be breastfed, it's difficult to push this work into clock time because it's hard to know how long this activity will take. A mother may be doing other tasks during the time that she is breastfeeding, as the whole process can take up to an hour, and it happens multiple times throughout the entire day. So from a Newtonian view of time, where time is quantifiable and measurable, most women would have difficulty estimating how much time they spend on breastfeeding in a single day and exactly when they did it. So breastfeeding then is a primary example of process time, or an enmeshing of time in social relations. Process time is embodied time. There is circularity, similarity. There is waiting. It's been argued that this clash of logics causes incompatibilities when women combine paid work and caring. But sociological, empirical research into women's unpaid care work and time has illustrated that caring is often experienced as work, and that women are often the temporal managers of their households and their children's schedules. These seemingly incongruent positions highlight an ambiguity between theories of women's time and the day-to-day realities of many women's temporal experiences. So then what this tells us is that caring practices are then embedded in this complex web of emotional and moral concerns and are highly relational and highly interdependent. Yet at the same time, they are enmeshed in institutional times and institutionalized practices which are routine, which are synchronized and often focused on clock time. So in this sense, this sort of finding diverges from conceptualizations of women's time as fluid, circular, and totally contrary to clock time. Indeed, men and others can experience what feminists have referred to as women's time when they take on significant caring roles. But it is still different to a certain extent because women are burdened with these sorts of normative gender assumptions about being a good mother. So what's significant about this way of seeing women's time is that it acknowledges the interdependence and richness of the experience of time for women that is a practical criticism of the dualistic way of conceiving of the world and knowledge that we are most familiar with. But there is a middle-class, heteronormative logic of reproductive temporality. As feminist scholar Jack Halberstam argues in A Queer Place and Time, not all people who have children ascribe to these mainstream notions of reproductive time that rely on a biological clock and this sort of strict scheduling. In contrast, queer subcultures produce alternative temporalities or queer time, by imagining futures that operate outside of these paradigmatic markers of life experience that go in order, sort of birth, marriage, reproduction, etc. In other words, queer time has been conceptualized as the practices and structures that oppose these conventional forms of belonging and identification that I've been talking about up until now. As Halberstam writes, quote, "Queer time for me is the dark nightclub, the perverse turn away from the narrative coherence of adolescence, early adulthood, marriage, reproduction, child-rearing, retirement, death, the embrace of late childhood in place of early adulthood or immaturity in place of responsibility." They say it is a theory of queerness as a way of being in the world and a critique of the careful social scripts that usher even the most queer among us through major markers of individual development and into normativity. But now I want to talk about breaking feminist waves. Since Kristeva's germinal essay, a new generation of feminists have grown up, and a new terminology of feminist waves have emerged. As she predicted, feminists have become increasingly critical of the linear wave model of feminism. I mean, we often think about the first wave of feminism as one long, powerful surge, pounding the beachhead of patriarchal politics and slowly wearing away its most entrenched form of inequality, suffrage. In contrast, second wave feminists fought to challenge the private as well as the public, the psychological as well as the economic, the cultural as well as the legal sources of male dominance. The second wave is often portrayed in the media as the bra burners. Then the third wave is characterized as a rebellion against second wave mothers. It represents a radical breakthrough, an ideological turn, and a sharp departure from the second wave. The essential framing for the third wave begins with Anita Hill's 1991 sexual harassment testimony against Supreme Court nominee Clarence Thomas in the US. Anita Hill became a symbol of women's status in American life, and in particular, their exclusion from the halls of power. Yet the ordering of feminisms into these successive temporal waves is problematic because it constrains the way that feminist theories and histories can be mapped and understood. It also implies that only one type of feminism is possible at a time, and that older ways of theorizing and practicing feminisms somehow become obsolete as time moves on. So to overturn this linear wave model, feminists have called for these alternative, non-linear concepts of historical time, and that are also multi-directional in order to facilitate conversations between feminisms of past, present, and even future. When we speak of historical time in relation to feminism, are we referring to objective or subjective time? Is it time bound by the laws of physics? Is it imagined or real? Thinking of feminism in terms of the waves ensures that once a feminist agenda has been achieved, another wave will simply bring about the next change. Now, Sarah Afzal and Paige Wallace argue that what they call the feminist mesh is a new way of looking at feminist knowledges through these intricate connections and entanglements. So they talk about the feminist mesh as this expanding set of nodes used to access feminist ideas and structures. These nodes are a point of intersection at which generational feminist knowledge becomes enmeshed with an active and visible fight against the everyday violence perpetrated by patriarchal hierarchies of power. So while the feminist mesh does not aim to necessarily completely reject the wave model of feminism, it is a model that is clever because it connects and stores the energy of each wave by holding together lines of feminist knowledge. The simultaneous action of holding together feminist stories and allowing them the freedom to continue moving and intersecting with new knowledge is made possible by the flexibility of the mesh. This mesh is a useful framework for viewing movements like #MeToo and #TimesUp as these entanglements around sexual harassment and sexual assault, where new feminist knowledge and stories are constantly intersecting. For instance, What does it mean to say that someone's time is up in 2019? One way to think about it is in terms of the relationship between time and the politics of knowledge production, especially feminist knowledge production, as I've been talking about. Time has always been a key object for feminism. And as the philosopher Elizabeth Grosz points out, a central question for feminist theory then should be about what is untimely. For Grosz, temporality is important for feminist theory to not only reassess the past and how it affects the present, but to also leap into the future, because it can point us towards reimagining a future that does not exist yet. If we are to see #MeToo and #TimesUp as these important points of intersection in this sort of infinite sprawling network of the feminist mesh, we can not only trace the connections leading up to the #MeToo movement, but also use this point of intersection as a way to leap into the future. As Grosz points out, in undertaking this kind of activity, feminist theory is able to leap into a future it does not control through finding something untimely in the patriarchal present and past. So for feminist theory, the notion of untimeliness can suggest that the relationship between past, present, and future is not linear or straightforward. So to say that somebody or someone's time is up then points towards that leap in the future. Because now hashtags on social media are the sorts of alternative archives that anticipate the kind of leap into the future that Grosz is talking about. It is precisely through users, but mainly women, who are adding their voices to this alternative archive that directs feminism to change and to change the future. The feminist mesh asks us to zoom in and to zoom out and see the intersections. And it asks us also to see the particularities at the intersections. #MeToo and #TimesUp have become powerful precisely because of their connections across past and present. So I want you to think, we go back to Anita Hill in 1991, and we move forward to Christine Blasey Ford in the US. Because here we can see that the feminist mesh works in entanglements rather than isolated endpoints. The perspective mechanism of the mesh allows us to see how the struggles of feminists today are connected along a path of intricacies to the struggles that have come before and to the ones that are brewing on the horizon. The zooming in and out mechanism of the feminist mesh is similar to the ebb and flow of those feminist waves, but it does not lose energy when the wave hits the shore, which is ultimately what we call the patriarchal wall. Well, so what? Feminist analyses are important because they've made the mundane visible, and they've amplified the voices around a temporality of human existence that has been silenced by the dominant, mainly economic view of time. Woman's time is full of emotion and affect. It is never merely clock time. But also, what of Kristeva's women's time? Women's time today is no longer confined to these sorts of essentialist and universalist notions of reproduction, or even the rupture with patriarchal social and political orders. It is identified instead with a rethinking, an epistemological break, pastness, futurity, and temporal remainders. We are constantly being told that feminism is over. The battles have been won, that feminism is dead. We've been told that it's had its time. What I've tried to show you today is that feminism is polytemporal, nonlinear, complex, embodied. It is vibrant. By unlocking our feminist past and presence, we bring about our feminist futures. Thank you.
Il y a évidemment beaucoup de questions, mais il ne peut pas y avoir de synthèse, parce que la question n'est pas de chercher la vérité. La question est comment nous sommes capables de faire évoluer les valeurs de notre société pour reconsidérer le problème fondamental du pouvoir dominant établi pendant des millénaires peut-être par l'homme. Et je ne pense pas que, vous avez entendu Meredith, je ne pense pas que l'explication naturelle ou naturaliste de la domination masculine sur le temps soit encore aujourd'hui tenable, même si le temps, effectivement biologique, est manifestement évident dans la reproduction féminine. Alors, je ne pourrais pas faire de synthèse, mais je voudrais qu'on ait une ou deux, trois questions, notamment des hommes. Questions from men. You have plenty of questions to ask. You don't dare? Une question ici. Wait for the microphone.
I'm not a man, can I?
Yeah, but you're allowed to.
Am I allowed to pose a question? It's very interesting. I was very excited by your question and answer relating linear time to male dominance. It's correct. The structure of time is hierarchical. It is a relation of power between things, between beings. And yes, this is the problem. Time associated throughout the history with male domination. But I wanted to tell you that in Greek mythology, for instance in Plato, the opposite of time was space, and space was the concavity of space, okay, was associated with female. And this is very interesting because if time is the principle of corruption, physical and moral, space is the principle of creation because in Ionian philosophy, Greek Ionian philosophy, matter was created from space and not in function of time. So these are interesting considerations, and I think it would be interesting, it would be, in the future, would be useful if you could think also this problem, space related to the creation of matter and to female creation.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, there's a large body of feminist work. You know, for example, feminist geographers who look at these sorts of questions, and I mean, the fight for time is parallel, intersecting with the fight for space, taking up space, what space means, and how that relates with relationships, working, organizations, all these things that.
Space is not hierarchical, it's a fractal object. That means in space there is infinity and equivalence. The spatial relation between objects is simultaneity. That means equivalence. So this is very interesting, the relation of simultaneity, equivalence to the female.
Well, but I mean, I suppose maybe in theory, but the practical realities of space are that if we think about an embodied view, certain bodies do take up more space than others.
I'm talking about the metaphysical symbolism of space. Okay,
yeah.
Thank you very much.
Hello, thank you very much for your talk. I was wondering whether when you were speaking of, you spoke about multiple times. You had the times of history of feminism, but also the conception of time we use when we say I have no time to do what you want me to do, for instance. And this happens a lot to people submitted to constraints, like all the women in the history of mankind that are submitted to patriarchal constraints. So in the end, when you speak of time, do you speak of liberty in a sense?
I guess, well, liberty for whom? For women?
Yeah, yeah, for women. I don't want to generalize the problem to any kind of domination, but yeah, in terms of women sensation, do you speak of time as liberty? Either they can't have, either they want to conquer, for instance.
I mean, I guess it depends on how you look at it. I mean, when I talked about the example of, like the recent example of #MeToo and what that means in terms of the timeliness or untimeliness of bringing forward, say, accusation of sexual harassment, then maybe we read that as liberating, because just because it happened in the past doesn't mean it's forgotten. But if we talk about time as liberating from a gendered perspective, I mean, from all of the things, the sort of the examples I raised, time has never really been liberating for women as long as their bodies and their existences are tied up with something like reproduction. So, I mean, I guess it depends on which lens you're going to look at these sorts of questions with, or what examples you talk about. But it's powerful. I guess that's the ideal. Is the future, you know, maybe the feminist mesh is pushing us closer to liberté.
During your presentation. It was too much, maybe. Une autre question? One more question? I have a question.
Okay.
Are you optimistic about quick change?
I think so. You have to be optimistic. I mean, I think that where it may sound like I started on a relatively depressing note, talking a lot about the patriarchal wall, I mean, I think that what's lovely about trying to reimagine feminist engagement, feminist activism, but also the way in which individual people are intervening in these sorts of questions does bring hope, is optimistic. It's a powerful future. And I think that, you know, looking at these sorts of questions, I mean, amidst all the ways in which, say, time is being examined in this particular setting, you know, a feminist lens brings us new questions to ask, and that's radical. That's a sort of radically creative way of attempting to examine these problems.
Finally, it's a global questioning. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Time is going on.